At 34, Reign Thorne had perfected the art of invisibility in plain sight. Working the night shift at a 24-hour diner in downtown Phoenix, she moved through her routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who preferred to blend into the background. Her uniform was always clean, but never pressed, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her interactions with customers remained polite but brief. To everyone who knew her, Reign was just another single woman working hard to pay the bills, living quietly in a small apartment above the hardware store on 3rd Street. But 3 men who walked into Maverick's diner that humid Tuesday night in August were about to discover that some people aren't what they appear to be. What they couldn't see beneath Reign's unassuming exterior was a past so classified that even mentioning certain details could land someone in federal prison. They couldn't know that the waitress refilling their coffee had once been Captain Reign Isabella Thorne, call sign Phantom, one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in U.S. military history. The 3 men thought they had found an easy target. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Reign's alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 p.m. every day, just as the Arizona sun began its descent toward the horizon. She'd roll out of her narrow bed, shower in the tiny bathroom with the leaky faucet she'd been meaning to fix for months, and dress in her standard uniform: black slacks, white button-down shirt, and comfortable shoes that could handle 8 hours on her feet. The routine never hadn't varied for the past 6 years since she'd arrived in Phoenix with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination to disappear completely. Her apartment was spartanly furnished. A bed, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a couch she'd bought secondhand from a family moving to California, and a television that received exactly 4 channels clearly. The only hint of her previous life was carefully hidden: a locked metal box tucked behind winter clothes she rarely needed in the desert heat. Inside that box lay medals she couldn't display, commendations she couldn't mention, and photographs of teammates whose names were still classified 6 years after their final mission together. The walk to Maverick's diner took exactly 12 minutes at her normal pace. Reign knew this because she'd timed it obsessively during her first weeks in Phoenix, when hypervigilance was still her default setting and every shadow could hide potential threats. She'd chosen the apartment specifically for its proximity to work and its clear sightlines in all directions. Old habits died hard, even when you were trying desperately to kill them. Maverick's diner occupied a corner lot on Central Avenue, its neon sign flickering sporadically in a way that suggested electrical problems no one had bothered to fix. The interior hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Red vinyl booths with cracks sealed with electrical tape, a long counter with chrome stools, and linoleum flooring that had seen better decades. The coffee was strong, the food was adequate, and most importantly for Reign, the clientele was predictable. She'd worked the night shift for 6 years, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving coffee to insomniacs, meals to late shift workers, and breakfast to early risers who preferred their eggs before dawn. Brixton Colt, the owner, was a gruff man in his 50s who asked few questions and paid in cash when requested. He'd hired Reign after a 5-minute conversation that focused more on her availability than her experience. "You got any problems I should know about?" Brixton had asked during that initial interview, his weathered face steadying her with eyes that had seen plenty of people running from something. "No, sir," Reign had replied honestly. Her problems were the kind that didn't follow people to new cities or show up in background checks. "You can handle drunks without calling the cops every 5 minutes?" Reign almost smiled at that question. If Brixton only knew what she could handle. "Yes, sir. You start Monday." That had been the extent of her job interview, and it suited Reign perfectly. Brixton didn't pry into her past, didn't ask about family or previous employment, and seemed content to have an employee who showed up on time, worked efficiently, and never called in sick. In return, she gave him exactly what he needed: a reliable night shift waitress who could manage difficult customers and keep the coffee fresh. Her colleagues on the night shift were an eclectic mix of characters who'd found their way to Mavericks for various reasons. Knox Ramsey worked the kitchen, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd moved to Phoenix after his divorce and seemed content to cook burgers and wash dishes while listening to jazz through earbuds. Indy Fletcher handled the register and day shift prep work, a college student studying nursing who treated the job as temporary funding for her education. None of them knew that their quiet colleague had once led classified missions in places that didn't officially exist on any map. Reign's customer service style was professionally invisible. She took orders accurately, served food promptly, and engaged in just enough small talk to seem normal without encouraging deeper conversation. Regulars knew her as polite but private, friendly but not interested in sharing personal details. She'd perfected the art of deflecting questions about her background with generic responses that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything meaningful.
"You from around here, Reign?" a customer might ask. "I've been here a while now," she'd reply with a smile that didn't invite follow-up questions. "What'd you do before this?" "Little bit of everything. More coffee?" The technique worked flawlessly for 6 years. Phoenix was a city full of people reinventing themselves, running from something, or starting over, so a private waitress raised few eyebrows. Reign had chosen her new identity carefully. Unremarkable enough to avoid attention, competent enough to maintain employment, and forgettable enough that people wouldn't think about her when she wasn't around. But maintaining that invisibility required constant vigilance. Reign had trained herself to suppress the instincts that had kept her alive during 8 years of active duty. When someone approached her from behind, she forced herself not to spin around with her hand moving toward a weapon that was no longer there. When she heard unexpected noises, she didn't immediately scan for cover or escape routes. When customers raised their voices, she didn't automatically assess them as potential threats requiring neutralization. The hardest part wasn't suppressing her physical reactions, it was silencing the analytical mind that had made her exceptional at her former job. Reign's brain still cataloged every person who entered the diner, noting their body language, potential weapons, escape routes, and threat levels. She couldn't stop herself from memorizing license plate numbers or identifying which customers were carrying concealed weapons. The skills that had made Captain Thorne a legend in special operations circles made waitress Reign Thorne exhausted by the constant effort required to appear normal. Her apartment held no pictures, no mementos, no evidence of family or friends or a life before Phoenix. If someone broke in, and Sarah had prepared for that possibility with security measures that would have impressed professional burglars, they would find the dwelling of someone who existed purely in the present moment. No past, no connections, no vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The loneliness was crushing sometimes, especially during the quiet hours between 2 and 4 a.m. when the diner was empty except for the occasional drunk or insomniac. Sarah would stand behind the counter, wiping already clean surfaces and fighting the urge to remember the camaraderie she'd shared with her team, the sense of purpose that had driven every decision, the clarity that came from having a mission that mattered more than personal comfort. She'd chosen this isolation, knew it was necessary, but that didn't make it easier. Captain Thorne had been surrounded by people who understood her, respected her abilities, and trusted her with their lives. Reign, the waitress, was surrounded by polite strangers who saw only the surface she'd carefully constructed to hide everything that had once defined her identity. The transformation had been necessary for survival, but it had cost her almost everything that made life meaningful. Everything except the skills themselves, which lay dormant beneath her carefully maintained facade like a sleeping volcano. She'd spent 6 years proving to herself that she could be normal, that she could suppress the warrior she had once been in favor of safety and anonymity. But some things can't stay buried forever. And on that humid Tuesday night in August, when 3 men walked into Maverick's diner looking for easy prey, Reign Thorne was about to discover that 6 years of practiced invisibility was no match for 8 years of lethal training when genuine threats emerged from the shadows of her carefully constructed ordinary life. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The 3 men who walked into Maverick's diner at 11:47 p.m. on that Tuesday night carried themselves with the swagger of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. They slid into the corner booth like they owned the place, their voices already too loud for the quiet atmosphere that typically settled over the diner during the late shift. Trey Blackwood, the apparent leader of the group, was a thick-set man in his early 30s with arms covered in amateur tattoos and a goatee that failed to hide the weakness in his jawline. His criminal record, had anyone bothered to check, would have revealed a pattern of escalating violence, bar fights, domestic disturbances, and assault charges that somehow never seemed to stick thanks to witnesses who mysteriously changed their stories. Beside him sat Vance Holloway, tall and lean with the kind of nervous energy that suggested either amphetamines or barely controlled aggression. His pale blue eyes darted constantly around the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with the paranoid attention of someone who'd made too many enemies. A series of poorly healed scars across his knuckles told the story of fights won through brutality rather than skill. Vance had spent 3 years in state prison for armed robbery, an experience that had hardened his already cruel nature into something genuinely dangerous. The third member of their group, Cade Morrison, was the youngest at 26, but possessed a cold intelligence that made him arguably the most dangerous of the 3. Unlike his companions, Cade dressed well. Pressed khakis, a polo shirt, and expensive shoes that suggested legitimate income or very successful criminal enterprises. His clean-cut appearance masked a sociopathic nature that found genuine pleasure in other people's pain. He was the planner, the one who identified opportunities and calculated risks with the detached precision of someone who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business.
The 3 had met 2 years earlier in a Las Vegas holding cell, brought together by a botched casino robbery that had landed them each facing serious federal charges. A combination of prosecutorial incompetence, key evidence that mysteriously disappeared, and witnesses who developed sudden amnesia had resulted in plea deals that kept them out of prison but bound them together through shared secrets and mutual dependence. Since then, they had operated as a mobile crew, traveling through the Southwest and targeting what they considered easy marks: isolated businesses, vulnerable individuals, and situations where they could exercise power without facing meaningful resistance. Their method was simple but effective: identify targets who appeared defenseless, escalate confrontation until violence became inevitable, then disappear before law enforcement could mount an effective response. Phoenix had proven particularly fertile ground for their operations. The city's transient population, sprawling geography, and overworked police force created perfect conditions for predators who understood how to blend brutality with calculated mobility. They'd been operating in the area for 6 weeks, leaving behind a trail of traumatized victims and unsolved crimes that barely registered in the local news cycle. Tonight's target selection had been opportunistic rather than carefully planned. They'd been driving through downtown after unsuccessfully attempting to intimidate a convenience store clerk who'd turned out to have a shotgun under the counter and the confidence to use it. Frustrated and looking for easier prey, they'd spotted Maverick's diner through the window of their stolen Ford pickup truck. "Look at this place," Trey had said, studying the dimly lit interior through the glass. "Perfect. Probably just one waitress working alone, maybe an old cook in the back. We go in, have some fun,
clean out the register, and disappear. Vance had nodded eagerly, his pale eyes already bright with anticipation. I like it when they're alone. Makes things more personal. Cade had been more analytical, studying the building's layout and escape routes with the thoroughness that made him valuable to their operation. Simple job. In and out in 10 minutes, on the highway before anyone knows what happened. What none of them had noticed during their surveillance was the way the lone waitress moved through the diner. They hadn't observed the systematic efficiency with which she cleaned tables, the unconscious scanning of sightlines and exits, and the subtle tension in her shoulders that suggested constant awareness of her surroundings. They saw only what they wanted to see, a woman alone in an isolated location, apparently vulnerable and certainly outnumbered. As they settled into their booth, Reign approached their table with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained for 6 years. Her training automatically cataloged the 3 men, the leader's aggressive posture, the thin one's meth-fueled hypervigilance, the clean-cut one's cold calculation. Her instincts screamed warnings, but she forced herself to maintain the role she'd perfected. "Evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with some coffee?" Trey looked up at her with undisguised interest, his eyes moving over her body with the kind of predatory assessment that had intimidated countless other women. "Well, well, what do we have here? You working all alone tonight, sweetheart?" The question was clearly a probe, designed to establish her vulnerability and isolation. Reign had heard variations of it hundreds of times over the years from men who mistook her professional courtesy for weakness. "Can I get you something to drink?" she repeated, keeping her voice neutral. Vance giggled, a high-pitched sound that didn't match his intimidating appearance. "She's playing hard to get, Trey. I like that in a woman. Makes things more fun when they finally understand how things work." Cade remained silent, studying Reign with the kind of clinical attention that suggested he was already planning something unpleasant. His pale green eyes took in her build, her stance, her apparent physical capabilities, and filed the information away for future use. "3 coffees," Trey said finally, his voice carrying an undertone of threat. "And make sure they're hot, real hot. Sometimes accidents happen, you know what I mean?" Reign nodded once and walked back to the coffee station, every instinct in her body now fully alert. In the kitchen, Knox looked up from the grill where he was cleaning the cooking surfaces for the night. "Everything okay out there?" he asked quietly. Knox had worked enough late shifts to recognize trouble when it walked in the door. "Everything is fine," Reign replied automatically, but her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared the coffee, unconsciously positioning herself so she could keep the 3 men in her peripheral vision while maintaining the appearance of normal activity. When she returned to their table with the coffee, the dynamic had already shifted. The 3 men were no longer simply customers looking for service. They were predators who had identified their prey and were beginning the process of isolating and intimidating her. "Sit down," Trey said, patting the seat beside him. It wasn't a request. "We want to get to know you better. What's your name, beautiful?" "I need to keep working," Reign replied evenly. "Enjoy your coffee." As she turned to leave, Vance's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was deliberately painful, fingers digging into pressure points with the practiced cruelty of someone who enjoyed causing discomfort. For a moment, the carefully constructed facade of waitress Reign Thorne flickered. The analytical part of her mind that she'd spent 6 years suppressing suddenly came online, processing threat levels, tactical options, and potential responses with lightning speed. Vance's grip was strong but applied incorrectly. A simple twist and pressure application would break his hold and likely fracture his wrist. The leader was overconfident, leaning back in a position that would make rapid movement difficult. The quiet one was the real threat, positioned strategically with clear lines of sight to both her and the kitchen. But Captain Reign Isabella Thorne, call sign Phantom, had spent 6 years learning to be invisible. She couldn't afford to reveal herself now, not when doing so would destroy everything she'd built and potentially bring dangerous attention from people far more threatening than three small-time predators. Instead, she looked directly at Vance with the kind of calm that should have warned him he was making a serious mistake. "Let go of my wrist." Something in her tone made Vance's smile falter slightly, but Trey's laughter restored his confidence. "Ooh, she's got some fight in her. I like that. Makes things interesting." Vance's grip tightened, and Reign felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded lethal action in places where hesitation meant death. The muscle memory of a dozen different ways to neutralize the threat flowed through her body like electricity, each technique refined through years of training and combat experience. But she forced herself to simply pull away, accepting the bruising grip rather than responding with the violence that would have ended the threat permanently. The three men interpreted her restraint as weakness, their confidence growing as they mistook her self-control for helplessness. "That's better," Trey said with satisfaction. "Now why don't you tell us when you get off work? We thought we might show you a good time." In the kitchen, Knox had stopped pretending to work and was watching the scene unfold with growing concern. He reached for the phone to call the police, but Cade had positioned himself where he could see the kitchen clearly. Their eyes met through the pass-through window, and Cade slowly shook his head while moving his jacket aside to reveal the grip of a concealed pistol. Knox's hand froze halfway to the phone. He was a good man, but he wasn't trained for situations like this. Fear paralyzed him as he realized that whatever was about to happen, he was powerless to stop it. Reign saw the exchange and understood that the situation was escalating beyond the point where normal responses would suffice. These weren't just aggressive customers who could be managed through professional courtesy and firm boundaries. They were predators who had already committed to a course of action that would end badly for everyone involved unless someone with the skills to stop them took decisive action. The question was whether she was prepared to destroy 6 years of carefully constructed anonymity to protect herself and Knox from men who had clearly moved far beyond intimidation into the realm of genuine threat. As Trey reached into his jacket and Vance's other hand moved toward something concealed beneath the table, Reign Thorne realized that the choice was about to be made for her. The predators had picked their victim. They were about to discover that some prey could bite back. The tension in Maverick's diner thickened like smoke as the three men settled deeper into their predatory routine. What had begun as casual intimidation was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous, and Reign found herself walking a razor's edge between maintaining her carefully constructed identity and responding to threats that her training recognized as genuinely lethal. Trey pulled a switchblade from his jacket, not brandishing it openly, but letting it rest on the table where both Reign and Knox could see it clearly. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would have consequences. "You know what I think," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "I think you need to learn some manners. Maybe we should teach you how to be more hospitable to customers." Vance giggled again, the sound grating against the silence like fingernails on glass. His pale eyes had taken on the glassy sheen of someone riding a chemical high, making him unpredictable and exponentially more dangerous. "I bet she's never had proper customers like us before. We should show her how to really take care of people." But it was Cade's silence that worried Reign the most. While his companions performed their theatrical intimidation, he was studying her with the kind of analytical attention that suggested professional experience with violence. His position near the window gave him clear sightlines to both entrances, the kitchen, and the street outside. This wasn't random brutality, it was calculated predation, executed by someone who understood tactical positioning. "Look," Reign said, keeping her voice steady despite every instinct screaming at her to neutralize the threats immediately. "I don't want any trouble.
Why don't I just give you your coffee on the house and we can all have a pleasant evening?" Trey's laughter was harsh and triumphant. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't get to decide what kind of evening we're gonna have. That choice got taken away from you the minute we walked in here." That comment triggered something deep in Reigns' memory. A similar phrase spoken by a terrorist leader moments before she'd put 3 rounds center mass and watched him drop like a puppet with cut strings. The parallel was so exact that for a moment, the carefully maintained barriers between Captain Thorne and waitress Reign began to crack. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, weight moving to the balls of her feet, shoulders squaring in a stance that would allow rapid movement in any direction. The change was subtle, but Cade noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed as he studied her with renewed interest. "You served in the military," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through his companion's crude taunts. "What branch?"
The question hit Reign like a physical blow. In 6 years of careful anonymity, no one had ever looked past her facade closely enough to identify her background. The fact that this predator could read her so accurately meant he possessed experience and training that made him far more dangerous than his companions. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they carried the ring of falsehood. Cade smiled, and the expression was colder than winter. Army, Marines, or something more specialized? His hand moved casually to rest on his concealed weapon. See, the thing about military training is that it never really goes away. Changes how you move, how you think, how you assess threats. And right now, I'm betting you're running through about 6 different ways to kill all 3 of us before we could draw our weapons. Silence fell over the diner like a funeral shroud. Even Vance's manic giggling stopped as the implications of Cade's observations sank in. They had expected to find an easy victim, but they were beginning to realize they might have stumbled into something far more complex. In the kitchen, Knox watched the scene unfold with growing horror. He could see the change in Reigns' demeanor, the way she seemed to grow more solid and dangerous without moving a muscle. For 6 years, he'd worked alongside someone he thought he knew, but the woman standing in the dining room was revealing herself to be someone entirely different. Trey, less perceptive than his companion, but sensing the shift in dynamics, tried to regain control through escalation. "I don't care if she was a damn Navy SEAL," he snarled, rising from his seat with the knife now openly displayed. 3 against 1, and we've got weapons. Military training don't mean shit when you're outnumbered and outgunned. The comment revealed just how little Trey understood about the kind of training that had shaped Reigns' early adulthood. Elite special operations soldiers weren't trained to fight fair. They were trained to win by any means necessary, often against overwhelming odds and superior firepower. The fact that she was outnumbered and seemingly outgunned wouldn't have concerned Captain Thorne in the slightest. But Reign the waitress was still trying desperately to maintain the fiction that had kept her safe for 6 years. "Please," she said, and the pleading tone sounded wrong coming from someone whose stance suggested she could end the threat in seconds. "Just take whatever money is in the register and leave. No one needs to get hurt." Vance stood up beside Trey, pulling a snub-nosed revolver from beneath his jacket. The weapon was old and poorly maintained, but at close range, maintenance issues wouldn't matter. "Oh, someone's definitely going to get hurt," he said, his voice pitched higher with excitement. "Question is whether you make it easy or hard on yourself." The sight of the gun changed everything. Whatever slim hope Reign had harbored that this could be resolved without violence evaporated like morning dew. These men weren't just planning robbery, they were planning something much worse, and the presence of weapons meant they were prepared to kill witnesses. In that moment, 6 years of practiced invisibility warred with 8 years of lethal training for control of Reign Thorne's identity. The special operations soldier she'd been knew exactly how to handle this situation. Assess, prioritize, neutralize. 3 targets, 2 weapons, 1 probable concealed carry, multiple civilians in potential danger,
clear tactical advantages in positioning and training. The waitress she'd become wanted to believe there was still a peaceful solution, some way to de-escalate the situation without revealing the darkness she'd spent years trying to bury. Cade solved her dilemma by standing and drawing his own weapon, a sleek 9mm pistol that suggested both serious intent and professional experience. "Here's how this is going to work," he said conversationally. "You're going to lock the front door, turn off the lights, and then we're going to have ourselves a private party. The cook back there is going to join us too, and everybody's going to do exactly what we tell them to do." Knox appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale with terror, but his hands raised in surrender. "Please, man, we don't want any trouble. Just take the money and go." Vance swung his revolver toward Knox with the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed terrorizing the helpless. "Shut up, old man. Nobody asked you to talk." The moment Vance pointed his weapon at Knox, something fundamental shifted in Reign's psychology. For 6 years, she'd been willing to endure almost anything to maintain her anonymity, but watching innocent people threatened by predators triggered responses that had been hardwired into her soul during years of training in combat. Captain Reign Isabella Thorne, call sign Phantom, began to wake up. The change was subtle at first, a barely perceptible alteration in breathing pattern, a slight adjustment in stance to put her weight perfectly balanced for explosive movement. Her eyes began tracking targets with the kind of cold precision that had once made her legendary among special operations units. Cade noticed the transformation immediately and recognized it for what it was. "There she is," he said, almost admiringly. "There's the soldier. I was wondering when she was going to show up." Trey looked between Cade and Reign, confusion evident on his face. "What the hell are you talking about? She's just a waitress." "No," Cade replied, never taking his eyes off Reign. "She's not. Are you, sweetheart? You're something much more interesting than a waitress, something much more dangerous." Reign stood perfectly still, calculating distances, angles, timing. The knife was 8 feet away, manageable. The revolvers were the primary threats, but Vance was holding his weapon incorrectly, easy to disarm if she could close the distance. Cade was the real problem. His grip, stance, and positioning suggested genuine expertise.
"I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, and her voice had changed completely. Gone was the tentative politeness of the waitress, replaced by something cold and absolutely certain. "Take the money from the register and leave. Right now. This is your only chance." Trey laughed, but the sound was forced. "Or what? You're gonna call the cops? Fight all 3 of us? Lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but..." Reign moved. The transition from stillness to explosive action was so sudden that it seemed to violate the laws of physics. One moment she was standing passively beside their table, the next she was inside Trey's reach, her hand closing around his wrist with crushing force as the switchblade clattered harmlessly to the floor. The sound of bones breaking was audible throughout the diner. Trey's scream of pain shattered the night's silence as his wrist bent at an impossible angle. The sound was raw, primal, and completely at odds with the casual arrogance he'd displayed moments before. He dropped to his knees, cradling his shattered bones while staring up at Reign with eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What the..." Vance started to say, but his words were cut off as Reign pivoted with fluid precision, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus in a strike that drove all the air from his lungs. The revolver fell from his nerveless fingers as he doubled over, gasping like a fish out of water. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Cade, however, was already moving. Unlike his companions, he possessed the training and experience to recognize what was happening and respond appropriately. His pistol came up in a smooth, practiced motion, the barrel tracking toward Reign's center mass with deadly accuracy. But Captain Reign Isabella Thorne had spent 8 years learning to kill people who were just as well trained as Cade Morrison.
The moment she saw his weapon beginning to rise, she was already in motion, her body flowing sideways like water as the first shot thundered through the diner. The bullet punched through the space where she'd been standing and shattered the coffee pot behind a counter in an explosion of glass and scalding liquid. Before Cade could adjust his aim, Reign had closed half the distance between them, moving in the serpentine pattern that had once allowed her to cross a terrorist compound under fire without taking a single hit. Knox dove behind the kitchen counter as the second shot roared out, this one coming even closer to its target. He pressed himself against the floor tiles, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The quiet, unremarkable woman he'd worked alongside for 6 years had transformed into something out of his worst nightmares, or perhaps his most desperate hopes for rescue. Cade fired a third shot, but Reign was no longer where his tactical training told him she should be. Instead of continuing her lateral movement, she had suddenly reversed direction, using an overturned table as cover while she calculated her next move. The bullet sparked off the chrome edge of the table and embedded itself in the far wall. "She's military," Cade shouted to his companions, though Trey was still writhing on the floor and Vance was struggling to breathe. "Special forces, move to covering positions." But Vance was in no condition to follow tactical instructions. The strike to his solar plexus had been delivered with surgical precision, temporarily paralyzing his diaphragm and leaving him helpless. Trey, cradling his ruined wrist, could barely focus on anything beyond his own pain. Reign assessed the new tactical situation with the cold efficiency that had made her legendary in circles where legends were written in blood. Primary threat, Cade, armed with a 9mm pistol, approximately 12 rounds remaining based on the weapon's profile. Secondary threats, Vance, incapacitated but likely to recover motor function within 60 to 90 seconds. Trey, injured but still mobile, knife on the floor within his reach. Civilian in danger, Knox, currently in cover but vulnerable if the engagement moved toward the kitchen. Mission parameters: neutralize all threats while minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding collateral damage that might draw unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that could compromise her carefully maintained anonymity. The analytical framework that had once guided her through the most dangerous operations in the world snapped into place like a well-oiled machine. For the first time in 6 years, Captain Thorne was fully operational. She moved again, this time using the diner's layout to her advantage. Years of working in this space had given her intimate knowledge of every obstacle, every sightline, every potential piece of cover. What Cade saw as furniture, she saw as tactical opportunities. Rolling behind the long counter, she came up near the kitchen pass-through, where a rack of clean coffee mugs provided both concealment and ammunition. Her hand closed around a heavy ceramic mug just as Cade's fourth shot punched through the counter 6 inches from her head. The mug flew through the air with the accuracy of a guided missile, striking Cade's gun hand at the exact moment he was lining up his 5th shot. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as his grip loosened from the impact, but he managed to maintain control of the pistol through sheer determination and professional training. "You're good," he called out, genuine respect evident in his voice despite their lethal circumstances. "What unit? Delta Force? Rangers? Or something even more classified?" Reign didn't answer. Conversation was a luxury she couldn't afford when dealing with armed opponents who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Instead, she used his momentary distraction to advance her position, moving behind the row of booth seats toward the front of the diner.
Vance was beginning to recover, his breathing slowly returning to normal as the paralysis wore off. He reached for his fallen revolver with movements that were still clumsy but growing steadier by the second. In 30 more seconds, he would be combat effective again. Trey had managed to retrieve his switchblade with his uninjured hand, the blade sliding out with a metallic snick that echoed through the diner like a promise of violence. Despite his broken wrist, he was still dangerous. Pain could make desperate men unpredictable and therefore more hazardous than they appeared. Cade adjusted his position, trying to get a clear shot at Reign's new location while keeping both his companions and the exits in his peripheral vision. His tactical thinking was sound, but he was operating under a critical misconception.
He believed he was facing a former soldier who had retained some of her training despite years of civilian life. He had no idea he was fighting a ghost. Captain Reign Isabella Thorne had earned her call sign Phantom not because she was good at hiding, but because she had mastered the art of being exactly where her enemies least expected her to be when they least expected her to be there. The nickname had originated during a classified operation in Eastern Europe where she had eliminated an entire terrorist cell without any of them realizing they were under attack until it was too late. Now, crouched behind a booth seat while calculating angles and timing, she felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most successful missions. The woman who processed customer complaints and worried about making rent disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who viewed the current situation as simply another problem to be solved through the precise application of controlled violence. Cade fired his sixth shot, the bullet tearing through the vinyl seat cushion inches from where he thought she was hiding. Stuffing and fabric exploded in a white cloud, providing momentary concealment that Reign exploited ruthlessly. She emerged from cover low and fast, moving at an angle that put Trey between herself and Cade's line of fire. Her hand swept the broken switchblade from Trey's grasp with a motion so quick it seemed like sleight of hand, the weapon spinning away across the floor to clatter harmlessly against the far wall. Trey lunged at her with his uninjured hand, desperation lending strength to his movements. But desperation was no match for 8 years of close-quarters combat training. Reign sidestepped his clumsy attack with minimal effort, her own hand moving in a precise strike that targeted the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. Trey collapsed instantly, his body going limp as the strike temporarily disrupted the neural pathways controlling his motor functions. He would recover eventually, but for the next several minutes, he was completely helpless. Vance had finally regained enough coordination to raise his revolver, but he made the fatal mistake of trying to line up a careful shot instead of simply firing in Reign's general direction. The hesitation cost him everything. Moving with the fluid grace that had once allowed her to ghost through enemy territory undetected, Reign closed the distance between them while his weapon was still rising. Her hand clamped over the revolver cylinder, preventing it from rotating and rendering the weapon useless. Her other hand struck the pressure point behind his ear with surgical precision. Vance joined his leader on the floor, unconscious before his body finished falling. 2 down, 1 to go. Cade had used the brief engagement with his companions to reposition himself near the diner's front entrance, putting his back to the wall and giving himself clear sight lines to most of the dining area. His weapon was steady in a two-handed grip, and his breathing remained controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Impressive," he said calmly, "but you're out of cover and I've got 6 rounds left. Even someone with your training can't dodge bullets from this range." Reign stood in the middle of the dining area, apparently exposed and vulnerable. But her posture radiated the kind of confidence that should have warned Cade he was missing something crucial. "You're right," she replied, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "I can't dodge bullets." Cade's fingers tightened on the trigger. "I don't have to." The lights went out. The diner plunged into absolute blackness as Reign hit the main breaker switch she'd located during her first week of employment 6 years ago. In the world of special operations, controlling the battlefield meant controlling every advantage, and darkness was an advantage that heavily favored the defender who knew the terrain. Cade's voice cut through the blackness, steady but edged with tension. "Clever, but I've got night vision training too, sweetheart. Military teaches you to fight in the dark." What Cade didn't understand was the difference between military training and the specialized skills taught to operators who worked in the deepest shadows of classified operations. Regular soldiers learn to function in darkness. Elite special operations soldiers learn to become one with it. Captain Thorne had spent 18 months in a classified program that existed in no official records, learning techniques developed by intelligence agencies for operations that couldn't officially happen. She'd trained in sensory deprivation chambers, learned to navigate complex environments by sound and air currents, and mastered the art of moving through hostile territory without disturbing so much a dust mote. In the absolute darkness of Maverick's diner, she was no longer at a disadvantage. She was in her element. The first indication Cade had that his situation had fundamentally changed came when he heard nothing. Not the sound of footsteps, not the whisper of clothing against furniture, not even the soft rhythm of controlled breathing. It was as if his opponent had simply vanished from existence.
He fired a shot toward where he'd last seen her, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the empty space where she was no longer standing. The thunder of the gunshot faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. "Where are you?" he called out, unable to keep a note of uncertainty from his voice. The answer came from directly behind him, so close he could feel breath against his ear. "Right here." Cade spun around, his weapon tracking toward the sound, but his barrel met only empty air. By the time he completed his turn, she was gone again, having moved with a silence that seemed to defy the laws of physics. From across the diner, Knox pressed himself against the kitchen floor and marveled at what he was witnessing. Even in complete darkness, he could sense the deadly dance taking place in the dining room. The woman he'd worked with for 6 years was hunting a trained killer through the blackness like some kind of supernatural predator. Cade fired 2 more shots in quick succession, aiming at different points where he thought he'd detected movement. Both rounds found nothing but empty space and diner furniture. The muzzle flashes revealed glimpses of overturned tables and scattered debris, but no sign of his target. "You're wasting ammunition." Reign's voice came from a completely different location than where the shots had been aimed. 3 rounds left. Make them count. The psychological warfare was deliberate and devastating. By announcing his remaining ammunition, she was forcing him to confront the reality that his primary advantage was rapidly diminishing. Every shot that missed brought him closer to helplessness. But Cade was a professional, and professionals didn't panic even when facing circumstances that defied their training. He controlled his breathing, forced his heart rate to slow, and began applying the systematic approach to threat assessment that had kept him alive through years of dangerous operations. Sound discipline. His opponent was moving without making detectable noise, indicating either exceptional natural ability or extensive training in stealth techniques. Positional awareness. She was changing locations faster than should be possible in darkness, suggesting intimate knowledge of the terrain. Tactical thinking. She was using psychological pressure rather than simply eliminating him immediately, which meant she either wanted information or was concerned about something beyond the immediate engagement. That last realization gave him hope. If she was holding back, it meant she had vulnerabilities he could potentially exploit. "You can't kill me," he said into the darkness, his voice carrying forced confidence. "Not without bringing attention you can't afford." Gunshots in downtown Phoenix at midnight? Police response time is 8 minutes max. You've got maybe 6 minutes before this place is crawling with cops, and something tells me that official attention is the last thing you want. Silence greeted his observation, but it was a different quality of silence, the kind that suggested he'd struck closer to the truth than she was comfortable with. Cade continued his analysis aloud, partly to gather information and partly to maintain his own psychological equilibrium. 6 years hiding in plain sight, working a job that keeps you invisible. That's not standard witness protection. That's someone running from something official. Military justice? Intelligence agencies? Or maybe something worse. A slight sound from his left, the whisper of fabric against vinyl, sent him spinning in that direction with his weapon extended. But again, there was nothing there when he arrived. "Getting warmer." Reign's voice came from his right, and this time he could hear something new in her tone. Not concern exactly, but a calculation that suggested his words were having an impact. Cade pressed his advantage. "You're not supposed to exist anymore, are you? Officially dead? Record sealed? New identity created from scratch? That's deep black ops classification, the kind they use when operators know too much to be allowed back into civilian life normally."
The silence stretched longer this time, and Cade began to think he might have found the psychological pressure point that would give him an opening. Whatever had driven this woman into hiding was clearly sensitive enough that even discussing it created hesitation. He was so focused on the psychological warfare that he almost missed the subtle change in air pressure that indicated someone moving very close to his position. Almost. His weapon came around just as a hand closed over the barrel, applying pressure in exactly the right place to prevent the firing pin from striking the cartridge. Even in complete darkness, she had found the one grip that would render his pistol useless without actually disarming him. "Impressive analysis," Reign said quietly, her voice now close enough that he could feel the vibration through the weapon they both held. "But you made one critical error in your assessment." "What's that?" Cade managed to ask, despite the cold certainty that his situation had just become terminal. "You assumed I was hiding from my own people." The implications of that statement hit Cade like a physical blow. If she wasn't running from American intelligence agencies, then her exile was voluntary, which meant her skills and knowledge were intact, her training current, and her psychological profile indicated someone who chose isolation over the normal rewards of military service. That suggested a level of dedication to operational security that went beyond mere self-preservation. It indicated someone whose sense of duty extended to protecting secrets that were more important than personal comfort or recognition. In other words, he was dealing with the most dangerous kind of special operations soldier, one who still believed in the mission even after it had cost her everything. "The people I served with trusted me with things that could reshape global politics," Reign continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I chose exile to keep those secrets safe, but that same commitment to duty means I won't hesitate to eliminate threats to innocent people."
Knox, still pressed against the kitchen floor, heard something shift in the darkness. A sound like metal being carefully manipulated, followed by the distinctive click of a firing mechanism being disengaged. "However," Reign added, and her voice had moved again, "it also means I prefer solutions that don't create more problems than they solve. You have a choice to make, Cade Morrison." The use of his full name sent a chill down Cade's spine. Even in the dark, even while engaged in life-or-death combat, she had somehow identified him completely. You can walk out of here with your unconscious friends and disappear from Phoenix forever. Or you can continue trying to fight someone who learned her skills in places where your training would barely qualify you as a promising recruit. Cade stood in the darkness, holding a weapon that had been rendered useless, facing an opponent who had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in his experience. For the first time in years, he found himself completely outmatched. But he was also curious. "What were you? Really? Does it matter?" Reign replied. "You'll never see me again either way." The lights suddenly blazed back to life, revealing the devastation of what had been a quiet neighborhood diner. Trey and Vance lay unconscious on the floor, their weapons scattered harmlessly around the room. Cade stood near the front door, his pistol held at an odd angle by a grip that prevented it from firing. And Reign stood behind the counter, looking exactly like the unassuming waitress she'd appeared to be when they'd first walked in. Except for her eyes. Her eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had killed when necessary and would do so again without hesitation. "Choose," she said simply. Cade looked at his unconscious companions, then at the woman who had systematically dismantled 3 armed men using nothing but skill and intelligence. The smart play was obvious. "We'll go," he said quietly, "tonight, and we won't be back." Reign nodded once. Good choice. As Cade began the process of collecting his unconscious partners, Knox slowly emerged from the kitchen, his face pale with shock and confusion. "Reign?" he said uncertainly. Who are you?" For a moment, the mask of normalcy slipped completely, and Knox caught a glimpse of someone whose presence seemed to fill the entire diner, despite her small stature.
"I'm exactly who I've always been, Knox," she replied gently. "Just someone who used to have a different job." The aftermath of violence carried its own unique silence. As Cade dragged his unconscious companions toward the diner's exit, the only sounds were the scrape of bodies across linoleum and the steady drip of coffee from the shattered pot behind the counter. Knox stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, his understanding of reality fundamentally altered by what he'd witnessed. Reign methodically began cleaning up the debris, her movements precise and efficient as she collected scattered weapons and overturned furniture. To anyone watching through the window, she might have appeared to be simply tidying up after a busy shift. Only the practiced way she handled the firearms revealed the depth of her experience with violence and its consequences. "Should we call the police?" Knox asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Reign paused in her cleaning, a damaged coffee mug in her hands. "What would we tell them? 3 men came in for coffee and accidentally hurt themselves falling down?" The question hung in the air as Knox processed the implications. He'd worked enough late shifts to know that official reports meant official attention, and official attention meant questions that someone like Reign clearly couldn't afford to answer. Cade had managed to get both his partners upright, though they remained largely unconscious. Trey's broken wrist would need medical attention, and both men would wake up with concussions that would leave them confused about exactly what had happened. At the door, Cade paused and looked back at Reign. "This doesn't end here," he said, though his tone carried more resignation than threat. "People are going to ask questions. We don't just disappear without consequences." Reign met his gaze steadily. "Your choice is simple, Mr. Morrison. You can spend the next few months looking over your shoulder, wondering when I might decide you represent a continuing threat to my security. Or you can take your friends, get the medical attention, and find a new line of work in a different state." She set down the broken mug and moved closer, her presence somehow filling the space between them despite the physical distance. "I've spent 6 years learning to be invisible, but I spent 8 years before that learning to find people who didn't want to be found. The skills don't just disappear because I changed careers." Cade nodded slowly, understanding the message behind her words. He'd thought he was dealing with a former soldier trying to maintain a quiet civilian life. Instead, he'd encountered someone whose capabilities extended far beyond anything he'd imagined. "What about them?" He gestured toward his unconscious companions. "They're not going to just forget this happened." "Memory is a fragile thing," Reign replied. "Head trauma can cause gaps, confusion. People sometimes remember events very differently than they actually occurred." The clinical way she discussed potential brain damage made Cade's blood run cold. He was beginning to understand that the woman standing across in him possessed a knowledge of human physiology that extended well beyond basic combat training. "They'll remember you hurt them," he said. "Will they?" Reign tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "Trey remembers being grabbed by someone much stronger than he expected. Vance remembers having trouble breathing. Both of them were drinking before they came here, weren't they? Sometimes alcohol and adrenaline create false memories." The clinical way she discussed potential brain damage made Cade's blood run cold. He was beginning to understand that the woman standing across in him possessed a knowledge of human physiology that extended well beyond basic combat training. "They'll remember you hurt them," he said. "Will they?" Reign tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "Trey remembers being grabbed by someone much stronger than he expected. Vance remembers having trouble breathing. Both of them were drinking before they came here, weren't they? Sometimes alcohol and adrenaline create false memories."
As if to emphasize her point, Vance began to stir, his eyes opening with the unfocused confusion of someone emerging from unconsciousness. He looked around the diner with obvious disorientation, his gaze passing over Reign without recognition. "What happened?" he mumbled, struggling to sit up. "My head feels like someone hit it with a hammer."
Cade realized that Reign had struck both men with surgical precision, creating exactly the kind of head trauma that would cloud their memories of events while leaving them functional enough to avoid serious medical complications. The level of anatomical knowledge required for such precise applications of force was staggering. "You fell," Cade told his partner, making a decision that would keep all of them alive. "Both of you tripped over each other like a couple of idiots. We need to get you to a hospital." As the three men stumbled out into the Phoenix night, Knox finally found his voice again. "They're just going to leave? After everything that happened?" Reign finished collecting the weapons and moved them out of sight behind the counter. "They understand the consequences of staying. Men like that are survivors first and predators second. When survival requires retreat, they retreat." Knox watched through the window as the three figures disappeared into the darkness, then turned back to study the woman he thought he'd known for 6 years. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, but her expression remained the same pleasant professionalism he'd grown accustomed to during their shifts together. "Who are you really?" he asked. Reign was quiet for a long moment, weighing her response. She'd spent years perfecting the art of deflection and misdirection, but the events of the evening had shattered the careful barriers she'd constructed between her two identities. "6 years ago, my name was Captain Reign Isabella Thorne," she said finally. "I served in units that don't officially exist, in places that aren't on any maps, doing things that never happened according to government records." Knox absorbed this information slowly. "What kind of things?" "The kind that keep people like you safe without ever knowing they were in danger." She began wiping down tables that didn't need cleaning, her hands needing something to do while she decided how much truth to share. "There are threats to national security that can't be handled through conventional military or law enforcement channels. Sometimes solutions require unofficial approaches." The euphemism didn't disguise the reality of what she was describing. Knox had seen enough action movies to understand the basic concept of black operations, but the woman standing in front of him represented something far more real and infinitely more dangerous than anything Hollywood had imagined. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Reign's hands stilled on the table she'd been cleaning. This was the question she'd dreaded for 6 years, the one that cut closest to the truth she'd been running from. "Because I learned something I wasn't supposed to know," she said quietly. "Something that certain people would kill to keep secret. The kind of information that makes you more dangerous to your own side than to the enemy." Knox waited for her to continue, sensing that interruption would break whatever spell was allowing her to share these revelations. "My team was sent to eliminate a terrorist cell that was supposedly planning attacks against American targets overseas. Standard mission parameters, nothing we hadn't done dozens of times before. But when we infiltrated their compound, I discovered they weren't planning attacks against Americans." Her voice took on the flat, emotionless tone of someone recounting facts that had lost their power to cause pain through repetition. "They were planning to expose American operations that violated international law. War crimes committed by people whose names you'd recognize from newspaper headlines. The terrorist cell was actually a group of journalists and whistleblowers." Knox felt the temperature in the diner drop several degrees. "What did you do?" "I completed the mission," Reign said, and for the first time since he'd known her, Knox heard genuine anguish in her voice. "I followed orders, eliminated the targets, secured the intelligence materials they'd gathered, came home and received a commendation for exceptional service to my country." She resumed cleaning the table with mechanical precision, her movements betraying the emotional turmoil she was struggling to contain. "It took me 3 months to piece together what had really happened, to understand that I'd killed innocent people to protect guilty ones. People who trusted their government to do the right thing, even when that government was willing to murder journalists to avoid accountability." Knox stood in silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was telling him. He'd spent his adult life in the comfortable belief that his government, whatever its flaws, operated according to basic moral principles. The reality Reign was describing challenged everything he'd assumed about the world. "So you ran," he said. "I made a choice," Reign corrected. "I could expose what I'd learned and destroy lives of people who were following orders, just like I was. Or I could disappear and take the knowledge with me, making sure it could never be used to hurt anyone else." Knox understood now why she'd chosen exile over normal military retirement. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just a former soldier. She was someone who'd sacrificed everything to protect secrets that were too dangerous to reveal, but too important to ignore. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Reign looked around the diner that had been her world for 6 years. The cracked vinyl booths, the flickering neon sign, the coffee-stained counter that would never look clean no matter how much she scrubbed it. "Every single day," she admitted. "But tonight reminded me why the sacrifice was necessary."
Knox didn't need her to elaborate. He'd seen what she was capable of when innocent people were threatened. If she'd remained in official service, those capabilities would be directed by people who might not always have innocent people's best interests at heart. "What happens now?" he asked. Reign surveyed the restored diner, noting that no trace remained of the violence that had occurred less than an hour ago. "Now we open for business tomorrow morning like nothing happened. You continue studying for your nursing degree, and I continue serving coffee to people who need a place to sit quietly in the middle of the night." Knox nodded, understanding that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to share widely. "And if something like this happens again?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Reign smiled. Not the professional courtesy she'd perfected as a waitress, but the cold satisfaction of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. "Then Phoenix becomes a much safer city for people who mind their own business and much more dangerous for people who prey on the innocent." 3 days after the confrontation, Maverick's diner had returned to its familiar rhythm of late-night solitude and quiet conversations. The broken coffee pot had been replaced, the bullet holes in the wall carefully patched and painted over, and the overturned furniture restored to its proper positions. To any casual observer, nothing had changed in the small corner establishment that served Phoenix's insomniacs and night shift workers. But for Reign Thorne, everything was different. The careful psychological barriers she'd spent 6 years constructing had been shattered in a single evening of violence. Captain Thorne's instincts, reflexes, and tactical thinking patterns had fully reintegrated with her civilian identity, creating a hybrid awareness that made her previous life seem like a half-remembered dream. She found herself unconsciously cataloging the threat potential of every customer who walked through the door. The businessman in the expensive suit triggered automatic assessment of concealed carry possibilities. The college student with the nervous energy got evaluated for substance abuse indicators. Even elderly Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Thursday night for black coffee and apple pie, was unconsciously scanned for anomalous behavior patterns. Knox noticed the change immediately. Reign moved differently now, more deliberately, with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture served a purpose. Her smile remained professionally pleasant, but her eyes held an alertness that hadn't been there before the confrontation. "You okay?" he asked, during a quiet moment around 2 a.m. when the diner held only a sleeping trucker and a woman reading a paperback novel in the corner booth. "I'm fine," Reign replied automatically, then caught herself. The lie came too easily, a reflexive response designed to maintain operational security even with someone who now knew her truth. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I'm remembering things I spent years trying to forget." Knox poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. 3 days of processing had given him time to absorb the magnitude of what he'd witnessed, but questions continued to multiply faster than answers. "The way you moved in the dark," he said quietly, "that wasn't just military training, was it? That was something else entirely."
Reign was quiet for a moment, watching the trucker's chest rise and fall in deep sleep. There are programs within programs, Knox. Training courses that don't appear in any official curriculum. Skills that get developed for operations that never officially happened. She refilled the coffee pot with practiced efficiency, but Knox could see her hands trembling slightly, the first sign of vulnerability she'd shown since the confrontation. After I completed basic special operations training, I was selected for additional specialized instruction. 18 months in a facility that doesn't exist on any government maps, learning techniques that push human capabilities to their absolute limits. Clocks of call? No. The language she used was carefully avoidant, that kind of thing. When they finished with us, we weren't exactly soldiers anymore. We were something else, something more specialized and considerably more dangerous. The woman in the corner booth looked up from her paperback novel, and Reign automatically shifted position to maintain visual contact while continuing her conversation with Knox. The movement was so subtle that Knox almost missed it, but the tactical awareness it represented was unmistakable. "How many people went through this training?" Knox asked. 47 entered the program, Reign said. 12 graduated. Of those 12, I'm the only one who's still alive. The simple statement carried the weight of tragedy and loss that Knox couldn't fully comprehend. He tried to imagine the kind of operations that would consume an entire unit of elite soldiers, leaving only one to carry their secrets into exile. What happened to the others? Mission casualties, training accidents. Some chose suicide over living with what we'd learned to do. Reign's voice remained steady, but Knox could see the cost of these memories in the tension around her eyes. One by one, the program eliminated its own graduates until I was the only repository of certain classified techniques and operational knowledge. Knox began to understand the true scope of what Reign had sacrificed by choosing exile. She wasn't just protecting generic military secrets. She was the sole survivor of a program that had invested enormous resources in creating human weapons, and those capabilities died with her if she remained hidden. "That's why you can't go back," he said.
"That's why they can't afford to let me go back," Reign corrected. "I represent too much investment and too much risk. If I remained in official service, eventually I'd be assigned to operations that would compromise my conscience. If I left officially, I'd become a security risk that needed to be managed permanently." The euphemism didn't disguise her meaning. Knox realized that Reign's exile wasn't just self-imposed. It was her only alternative to assassination by her own government. A new customer entered the diner, and Reign's attention immediately shifted to full tactical assessment mode. The man was tall, lean, with the kind of disciplined posture that suggested military background. He wore civilian clothes, but they were too clean and too perfectly coordinated for someone genuinely living a civilian lifestyle. He chose a booth with clear sightlines to both entrances and the kitchen, positioned himself with his back to the wall, and ordered black coffee with the kind of efficient courtesy that minimized conversation while gathering information about the server. Professional habits, Knox realized. The customer was evaluating Reign with the same systematic attention she was directing toward him. "Friend of yours?" Knox asked quietly. "Unknown contact with possible official connections," Reign replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Could be coincidence, could be surveillance, could be worse." She approached the customer's table with her standard professional demeanor, but Knox noticed that her route took her past the emergency exit and kept the counter between herself and the front door. "Good evening," she said pleasantly. "Can I get you anything besides the coffee?" The man studied her face with obvious interest. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk. I represent certain parties who are interested in your previous career experience." Knox felt the temperature in the diner drop several degrees. After 6 years of successful anonymity, someone had finally tracked down Captain Reign Isabella Thorne. Reign set the coffee cup down with steady hands, but Knox could see the tactical calculations running behind her eyes.
I think you have me confused with someone else. I just work here." The man smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. "Miss Thorne, we both know that's not entirely accurate. My employers are prepared to offer you something that I believe you'll find compelling." "And what would that be?" Reign asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "A chance to serve your country again, officially, with full reinstatement of rank, benefits, and the opportunity to put your unique skills to proper use." Knox watched the exchange with growing dread. The offer sounded generous, but Reign's body language suggested she was hearing a death sentence delivered in polite terms. "I'm not interested," she said firmly. The man smiled slightly. "I think you misunderstand, Captain. This isn't really an optional invitation. Recent events in your civilian life have demonstrated that your skills remain active. That represents a security concern that my employers feel needs to be addressed." The reference to the confrontation 3 days ago made Reign's blood run cold. If official agencies knew about her encounter with the 3 criminals, it meant her anonymity had been compromised far more thoroughly than she'd realized. "What kind of addressing did you have in mind?" "Voluntary return to active duty, with assignment to operations that fully utilize your capabilities. Or alternative solutions that ensure those capabilities never become a security risk." Knox understood the implied threat, even if the language remained diplomatically vague. Reign was being offered a choice between slavery and death, with no option for continued exile. "I need time to consider your offer," Reign said. The man nodded as if this response was expected. "Of course. You have 48 hours to make your decision. After that, the nature of available options may change significantly." He stood, left money for the coffee he hadn't touched, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. "Captain Thorne, for what it's worth, I hope you make the smart choice. People with your capabilities are rare, and it would be unfortunate if those abilities were permanently wasted." After he left, Knox and Reign stood in silence, both understanding that the careful equilibrium they'd established was about to be shattered once again. "What are you going to do?" Knox asked. Reign looked around the diner that had been her refuge for 6 years, then at Knox, who had become the closest thing to family she'd allowed herself since leaving her former life. "I'm going to remind certain parties why Captain Reign Isabella Thorne chose exile instead of elimination, and why that was the smart choice for everyone involved." Knox had heard that tone before. 3 nights ago, just before she'd systematically dismantled 3 armed predators with clinical efficiency. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher, and the opposition possessed resources that made 3 criminals seem like a minor inconvenience. The real war was about to begin. 47 hours had passed since the government agent delivered his ultimatum. Reign had spent every minute of those hours planning, preparing, and accepting the reality that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to end permanently. The only question remaining was whether she would go out on her own terms or theirs. At 11:30 p.m. on Friday night, Maverick's diner was busier than usual. The Friday evening crowd brought a mix of characters that provided perfect cover for what Reign knew would be her final shift as a waitress. College students cramming for weekend exams, late-shift workers grabbing dinner before heading to overnight jobs, and the usual collection of insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. Knox worked the kitchen with nervous energy, aware that something monumental was about to happen, but uncertain of the details. Reign had been unusually quiet during their shift, moving through her duties with mechanical precision while her mind operated on levels he couldn't access. At exactly 11:45 p.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up outside the diner. Reign watched through the window as tactical teams emerged from the vehicles with practiced efficiency. 8 operatives, all carrying automatic weapons and moving with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive training and planning. They positioned themselves to cover all exits while maintaining clear fields of fire into the interior. "Knox," Reign said quietly, never taking her eyes off the deployment outside, "I need you to go into the walk-in cooler and stay there until this is over." Knox looked through the window and felt his heart sink. "They came for you." "They were always going to come for me," Reign replied. "The 48-hour deadline was theater. They needed time to position assets and plan an operation that would minimize civilian casualties while ensuring I couldn't escape." She moved behind the counter, her actions appearing casual to the customers who remained unaware of the tactical situation developing outside. But Knox could see her systematically positioning herself for what was coming. "What are you going to do?" Reign's smile held the cold satisfaction of someone who had spent 2 days preparing for exactly this scenario. "I'm going to remind them why they spent 6 years pretending I didn't exist instead of trying to bring me in." The front door chimed as the government agent from 3 nights earlier entered the diner. He was now dressed in tactical gear and accompanied by 2 heavily armed operatives who immediately began scanning the interior for threats and escape routes. "Captain Thorne," the agent said formally, "your decision time has expired. I'm Agent Marcus Webb with the Department of Homeland Security Special Activities Division. You need to come with us immediately." Reign continued wiping down the counter, her movements unhurried despite the weapons trained on her. "I'm sorry, but my shift doesn't end until 6 a.m. Company policy prohibits leaving early without proper coverage." Several customers began to notice the tactical teams and started moving nervously toward the exits, only to discover that armed operatives were blocking all routes of egress. Panic began to ripple through the diner as people realized they were trapped in the middle of what appeared to be a federal law enforcement operation. "Everyone remain calm," Agent Webb announced to the room. "This is official government business. Nobody will be harmed if you cooperate fully." Knox watched from the kitchen doorway as Reign set down her cleaning cloth and looked directly at Agent Webb. Something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The last vestiges of waitress Reign Thorne disappeared completely, replaced by someone whose presence seemed to fill the entire diner. "Agent Webb," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to command in life-or-death situations. "You have 15 seconds to withdraw your operatives and leave this establishment before I demonstrate why your predecessors chose containment over confrontation." Webb laughed, though the sound carried nervous undertones. "Captain, you're outnumbered 8-1. Surrounded by armed federal agents and civilian witnesses prevent you from using lethal force. Surrender is your only viable option." Reign's smile was colder than winter. "Agent Webb, you've made 3 critical tactical errors that are about to prove fatal to your operation." She began moving slowly along the counter, her route seemingly random but actually calculated to position her for maximum advantage. "First, you assumed civilian witnesses would constrain my actions. But everyone in this diner has now seen federal agents threatening an unarmed waitress with automatic weapons. They're witnesses to your crimes, not mine." Webb's confidence faltered slightly as he processed the legal implications of her statement. Domestic deployment of military assets against American civilians was prohibited under multiple federal statutes, and the presence of witnesses complicated the official narrative considerably. "Second," Reign continued, now positioning herself near the kitchen pass-through where she had access to multiple routes and improvised weapons, "you assumed that 6 years of civilian life had degraded my operational capabilities. But specialized training doesn't atrophy. It just goes dormant until circumstances require activation." Knox watched in fascination as Reign seemed to grow more solid and dangerous with each word. The woman who had served him coffee every night for 6 years was revealing herself to be someone whose very presence changed the tactical dynamics of the entire room. And third, Reign said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the diner. You assumed that Captain Reign Isabella Thorne would submit to execution disguised as reactivation rather than fight for her right to exist. Webb raised his weapon, finally understanding that negotiation was no longer possible. All operatives, weapons free, take her down. The lights went out. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical perfection executed in complete darkness. Reign moved through the diner like a force of nature, using her intimate knowledge of the terrain and superior night-fighting capabilities to systematically neutralize threats that couldn't see her coming. The first operative went down to a coffee pot applied with surgical precision to the base of his skull. The second discovered that restaurant equipment could be weaponized in ways that tactical manuals never contemplated. The third learned that someone with Reign's training could disarm an automatic weapon in darkness with nothing but leverage and superior positioning. Webb fired blindly into the blackness. His muzzle flashes revealed glimpses of chaos but no sign of his primary target. Around him, his carefully planned operation disintegrated as his operatives fell victim to an opponent who had turned the familiar environment into a tactical nightmare. When the emergency lighting finally activated, 7 of the 8 operatives were unconscious or incapacitated. Webb stood alone in the center of the diner, his weapon trained on empty air while Reign appeared behind the counter as if she'd never moved. "Impressive response time on the emergency lighting," she commented casually, as if discussing the weather. 4 minutes and 30 seconds, almost fast enough to matter.
Webb looked around the devastated remains of his tactical team, then at the woman who had single-handedly destroyed a federal operation using nothing but skill and improvised weapons. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice carried the hollow ring of defeat. "Yes, it is," Reign replied with absolute certainty, "because you're going to return to your superiors and explain that Captain Reign Isabella Thorne died 6 years ago. The woman standing here is a civilian waitress who defended herself against armed intruders threatening innocent customers." She gestured toward the unconscious operatives scattered around a diner. "Your people will recover, receive medical attention, and be reassigned to operations that don't require explanations to congressional oversight committees about domestic military deployments." Webb understood the offer being made. Official acknowledgement that the operation had failed would result in investigations that his superiors couldn't afford. Accepting Reign's version of events would allow everyone to retreat with minimal consequences. "And if we don't accept your interpretation of events?" he asked. Reign's smile held the promise of consequences that extended far beyond the current engagement. "Then I stop trying to be invisible and start actively protecting my interests. I have enough classified knowledge to bring down administrations and enough operational capability to ensure that information reaches the right people regardless of official attempts at suppression." Knox emerged from the kitchen to find Reign calmly serving coffee to the few customers who had remained throughout the confrontation. The government operatives were being loaded into ambulances that had arrived with remarkable promptness, and Agent Webb was speaking quietly into a secured communications device. "Is it over?" Knox asked. Reign looked around the diner that had been her sanctuary for 6 years, noting the damage that would need repair and the memories that would never fade. "This phase is over, but Captain Reign Isabella Thorne can never really disappear completely. She's part of who I am, whether I'm serving coffee or saving lives." Knox poured himself a cup of coffee with hands that were finally steady. "So what happens now?" Reign considered the question while watching the last government vehicle disappear into the Phoenix night. "Now I find a new balance between the person I was trained to be and the person I chose to become. Maybe I can't be completely invisible anymore, but I can still choose how to use the gifts I've been given." Over the following weeks, reports began circulating through certain Phoenix neighborhoods about a mysterious woman who appeared whenever predators targeted the innocent. Criminals who preyed on the vulnerable found their operations disrupted by someone who moved like a shadow and struck with surgical precision.
The stories were dismissed by police as urban legend, but Knox knew better. Captain Reign Isabella Thorne had found her calling not in official service to distant government agendas, but in direct protection of the people who needed her most. The waitress who had served coffee to Phoenix's lost souls had evolved into something more powerful, a guardian who ensured that those who preyed on others would discover, too late, that they had picked the wrong victim. In a city full of people running from something, Reign Thorne had finally stopped running and started fighting back. And Phoenix became a much safer place for people who minded their own business, and infinitely more dangerous for those who didn't. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes of her former life, and she was magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.